Well, welcome to Lesson 9. Hey, red cedars and grizzly bears. Listen to find out what new things Lewis and Clark found and how they kept track of their encounter. And we have a guest speaker. You can guess who that might be.
This is Mrs. Rattenborough. I have been sitting at home waiting for my husband to get back, and all he wants to do is tell me about being in the African savannah and being in the desert southwest, the Sonoran Desert, and I thought, well, I'd like to get my 10 cents in talking about red cedars and grizzly bears. Why? Because I once saw a grizzly bear, and I once climbed a red cedar, and I went as far as I could, and then I found out I was only not even half the way up. It's a big tree. Anyhow, let me get to the story. Well, anyway, after Lewis and Clark sent some of the team back east with reports and scientific samples for President Jefferson, I bet there were a couple of rats in those bags too, the captains and the rest of their crew continued west. They rode in 2 of their original pirogues and 6 new canoes made from hollowed-out trees. These canoes, about 30 feet long and 3 feet wide, were really hard to balance. More than once, as the men were getting used to them, the canoes overturned in mid-river, forcing the men to fish out wet supplies before going on. Despite this, Lewis wrote in his journal that the men were happy and healthy. I think maybe that was a little bit of an exaggeration. You know what an exaggeration is? Speak to my husband, Mr. Rattenborough, if you want to know what exaggeration is. Soon, they left behind the flat plains and entered hilly land. Now, the Missouri River goes into some pretty big mountains. It became more difficult to travel. Forests of western red cedars lined the banks of the river. These beautiful trees were so important to the Native Americans of the area that some Native Americans called themselves people of the red cedar, performing special ceremonies before they chopped down the huge evergreens. Now, here is an actual photograph to prove to you that I, Mrs. Rattenborough, am not exaggerating when I say that red cedars are truly big trees. Here's a picture of one. Lewis and Clark knew that it would be impossible to take an entire tree back with them because they can get to about 200 feet high. That's as tall as a 20-story building. Nevertheless, the tree was so important to the lives of Native Americans, they knew that they had to gather samples and record its many uses. They drew pictures and collected branches, cones, and seeds. And as they learned more about the western red cedar from Native Americans in the area, both Lewis and Clark wrote about the importance of the western red cedar in their journals. The people and animals of the Northwest relied upon the tree for their existence. Native Americans used the bark of the tree to weave mats, baskets, and clothing, and used the wood to build canoes. Elk ate the leaves and shoots of the enormous tree. Bears hibernated or slept through the winter in hollow cedar logs. And what's that, Mr. Hoops? Hold on, I'm recording here, Mr. Hoops. Oh, that one, yes. Yes, Mr. Hoops has a picture of a red cedar that he saw, that he will share with you at the end of this reading. Well, now I can tell you why I am reading this and not my husband. He is afraid of grizzly bears. Well, it is wise to be afraid of grizzly bears, but I'm not afraid of pictures of one. The men often heard of the bears called grizzly bears that made their homes in the hollowed-out logs of the cedars. So as they made their way up the Missouri River, William Clark warned, "Keep a sharp eye out for grizzly bears." One of the hunters said, "Don't worry, Captain. We've seen plenty of bears before back in Kentucky." Black bears, yes. Grizzly bears, no. From what I hear, it's like the difference between a house cat and a lion. One day, Lewis and another man were out hunting along the riverbank. Suddenly, they saw 2 giant grizzly bears up ahead. Woo! The bears rose up on their hind legs, up and up, until they stood 8 feet tall. Then, roaring, the bears charged. Raising their rifles and taking careful aim, Lewis and his companion shot one bear, but the other one kept coming right at them with frightening speed. "Run!" shouted Lewis, and the 2 men turned and ran for their lives. Lewis and the other man stopped running to take another shot, turned, took aim, and fired at the same instant. The loud bang was followed by a tense moment as the bear suddenly stopped running. It held still for a moment, and then it toppled over. only when they were sure that the grizzly bear was dead did Lewis and his companion carefully approach the animal. Lewis later wrote in his journal that the bear weighed between 500 and 600 pounds and was 8.5 feet tall. Woo! That's taller than 2 first graders, one standing on the other one's head. After this frightening chase, Lewis told the whole party, "From now on, we must always move about and do even the simplest actions in parties of 2 or more. One man going alone up against a grizzly would not stand a chance."
Thank you, Mrs. Rattenborough, for an exciting story. I was a little worried there that one of those guys would not get away from that grizzly. They are dangerous, dangerous, dangerous animals. And I'll tell you something. When I was 19 years old, a friend and I went walking through the mountains of near the Missouri River, and we saw signs of bears, but we said, we're never going to see one. We camped out for a week, and we never saw a bear. And if I ever knew anyone who was thinking of doing something like that, I would make sure that they got helicoptered out and were seen by a competent doctor, because I would never do that again. I should never have done that then. Anyway, well, that's the end. And the next thing you're going to see is a picture of a red cedar that I saw on a trip to Washington State. It's a really, 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 really big tree. Anyway, keep listening, keep learning.